Hey, everybody. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about invasive species. I think this is a pretty interesting topic and is of importance as it applies to our area, especially in this Galveston Bay area. And so I'll try and share some examples that are local as we move forward. So we are in the second section, part B of the applied ecology area of the course outline. And we're going to go through some definitions and talk about invasibility, consequences, eradication, so on. You should be able to explain what invasive species are and their efforts on ecosystems when we're done. You should be able to describe the features that make habitats vulnerable to invasions, and you should be able to summarize invasive species management strategies. And I'm going to share with you some resources that you can learn more about that when we get to the end of this as well. All right, so let's talk through some definitions because I often find that with students there's some confusion between invasive versus introduced, right? Um, so invasive plants can be native or they can be introduced, right? Um, Native plants are native to an area, but some native plants have competitive advantages under certain conditions that allow them to essentially crowd out other native species. So, an example is one that, quite honestly, you've probably seen in our area, and that is typha. Typha latifolia is one common one, but these are cattails, right? And they're used commonly in drainage ways. You'll see them a lot of times. Sometimes they are actually planted there in order to address water quality. Sometimes they volunteer there because, again, they are very hardy and grow relatively quickly. Introduced species or exotic species are those that are not native to our region, but they tend to suddenly appear. Okay. Now, it really isn't suddenly. Typically, you can trace back the origins, either purposeful or accidental, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. Um, a lot of times, these species are from other places around the world and would not typically find their way here on their own. So they might be South American, they might be Asian, they might be European. Sometimes they're so aggressive that they now can be found globally. There's a clover, and I'm sorry, I forget the scientific name for it off the top of my head, but you would recognize it if you saw it. It grows everywhere and has little white flowers that look like alligator weed, but it isn't. It's just a little white clover. It is European in origin, and you can now find it on virtually every continent on the globe. It's amazing. So it's able to displace other species and just has a remarkable advantage. And it does have some benefits, and we'll talk about that as well, because sometimes invasives still can provide benefits to a community in spite of also providing or actually contributing to significant problems. Okay. So the question is, are all exotic species invasive? So there are some universal characteristics of invasive species, and that is that they have the ability to grow very rapidly. This can be through sexual reproduction and vegetative growth, and this facilitates their ability to spread. That in turn then allows them to establish a breeding population. Okay. Um, so we have a plant here we'll talk about a little more, but yeah, I'm sure you would recognize it. It's Chinese tallow. They're everywhere, even on Galveston Island. Chinese tallow have tremendous seed productivity, as we're going to see, and they can establish breeding populations very rapidly. And they have a competitive advantage in that, being from Asia, they do not have pests here that would otherwise control their population. So there's no top-down control on those trees. And this is true of a lot of invasives, especially plants. They tend to have high stress tolerance. So, wetland plants that are that are invasive tend to be able to tolerate flooding, anoxia, even salinity, which makes them very adaptable to these new environments. One thing I'll say about Southeast Texas and invasives here is that many of the species that um, are invasive that are also introduced tend to come from environments that are somewhat similar to what we have here in Southeast Texas. So for terrestrial plants, that means they tolerate a wide range of climate conditions, right? So they can go from really cold to really warm. They can tolerate our soils. They can tolerate the rainfall that we get. And when we're talking about wetland plants, it's the same. They tend to come from areas. So the two most common areas, to my personal experience, are Asia and South America. Those two places, the conditions of these plants that are introduced, um, they're coming from conditions that are similar, but they're different in the fact that there aren't controls really for them. And in some cases, they have the competitive advantage of, as we talked about, their ability to reproduce and grow very rapidly. So the problem with all of this is that it can cause a change in the community composition or ecosystem processes that are part of that biome, right? So this can be uh, a landscape level change in some instances, as we're going to see. So, are all exotic non-native species invasive? Are all invasive species non-native? Let's see. Oh, so clicker question here. Again, by the end of this, actually, you should be already able to answer this. But again, anytime with these recorded presentations, if you have questions, can't figure this out, let me know, and I'll be happy to help you. All right, so let's talk about invasibility. What makes a community prone to invasion? Well, um, there are a lot of factors that we're going to see. I'll tell you one really common one is areas that are disturbed. Disturbed areas tend to be very prone to invasion, and that would give them what we would consider high invasibility, the susceptibility of a community to invasion. Um, this can be measured in terms of the presence of that invasive species, the success of it, or in some cases, if you have multiple invasive species, the number of those, right? All right, so what controls these things? Well, in terms of habitat, as I mentioned, disturbance is a big one, right? Habitat modification. So, disturbance does a couple of different things. It frees up resources. So if you take out one thing, oftentimes that frees the resources up that species was using and makes it available to other species. Oftentimes that comes through harm to native species. Um, the other issues have to do with resource supply and then also diversity and species interaction within those communities. So, where you have higher resource availability, typically those also provide opportunity for invasion. So, there's a greater probability of other species invading those areas. And then the higher the diversity is, it's the opposite, right? Where you have high diversity, you have more ecologic niches filled. It really narrows the gap that an invasive species has to get a toehold in there, right? For one example, in here in our area in Texas City, there's a park. I won't name the park, but there was a park that I had the opportunity to do some work on when I was in graduate school many years ago, where um, they had built this park. They had gone in and put walking trails and a variety of small, hiker kind of amenities. There was a parking area. They put up a kiosk with a little shaded cover and that kind of stuff. But in the process of doing all of that, it disturbed the plant community that was there. And on top of that, in the parking area and the initial entry to the little park, it required mowing. And in this prairie, in order to manage the areas around the parking area, around the walking trails, right? They mowed those as well to keep things back. Well, the mowers mowed all over the area. So not just this park, they weren't dedicated to that area. And the contractors that mowed it did not have any protocols in terms of cleaning their equipment. So they would go from one place, load their equipment. They say, take care of one place. They load their equipment up on the trailer, move it to the next place, unload, mow, move, mow, move, mow, right? And so, and this is actually the case in for a lot of this type of maintenance that occurs on both private and public properties. And so the problem was that at some point, the mowers had gone through an area that had an invasive plant. It's a sedge species, and the common name is deep-rooted sedge. You can look it up. It's extremely common in our area, and it has all of the characteristics of invasive that we just talked about. And it pretty rapidly started to spread. So the mowers had some of the seeds from this sedge on it. And when they roll off, the seeds would vibrate off of the mowing equipment and they would get a foothold because where the mowers had gone, they had disturbed those areas, cut the plants back, and in some cases actually down low enough that bare ground was exposed. And in those areas where they had disturbed it with the mowers, the weed eaters, and all that stuff, which was usually, again, right along the walking paths and along the parking area, it gave those invasive sedge an opportunity to get a toehold, right? And the soils there are quite fertile. There's you know, an opportunity in terms of nutrients and water supply, and the environment wasn't pristine. So this was not, the park that they had wasn't pristine. It was nice. I mean, it was a nice little example of a prairie, and it made for a good walking area, easy access, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't perfect, and so the diversity wasn't super high, and it gave that deep-rooted sedge an opportunity just to take over. And within a short period of time, it was essentially a monoculture of deep-rooted sedge. So that's just one example of how these kinds of things can happen, right? And some cases, in fact, I would suggest in most cases, it's completely accidental. Nobody said we want to bring this here and we want to establish this thing here. Not always. Now, sometimes there are. Well, I'll share a case with that where there was an intention behind it. There is a theory dating back to the 1950s, Elton's theory of invasion, and it said communities with more species should be more resistant to invasion. The increasing number of species in a community essentially leaves fewer resources available for new species, in this case, invaders. And so, in essence, the invaders have to work much harder in order to establish a toehold against the home team, right? And so it's harder for them to get that toehold, and so oftentimes won't be able to establish, or if they do, they won't persist over a long period of time. They'll get crowded back out themselves. Um, there are a lot of invasive species, and a lot of routes of introduction. So sometimes it has to do with poor management. So for instance, Spartina alterniflora in some areas is native, like ours. There are some areas, especially in Europe, where our Spartina alterniflora is actually considered invasive in their particular environments. There are introductions through shipping, through transport, through maintenance, you name it. That mowing incident really shaped my understanding of invasive species. And I'll tell you, on infrastructure projects, when I was doing some consulting work on Corps of Engineers kind of infrastructure projects, one of the, one of the things that we often worked with the Corps to try and introduce was requirements for contractors and staff and internal staff when maintaining things like parks associated with dams, right? So if you've ever been to Canyon Lake, there's a great big park associated with that dam. How those are maintained is really important because there's an opportunity there for an introduction. Well, it's the same thing with shipping and transport. A lot of times when ships are leaving one port, they take on ballast water, and and when they take that ballast water in, they're sucking in water, but they're sucking in all of the organisms that are in that water as well. And then they carry them in there inside of the hull of the ship wherever they're going to. And oftentimes before they make port, or sometimes when they're in port, right? So especially if it's an interior port, like they have to go up a channel or in a river, they will slowly discharge that ballast water in port as they're coming into shallower and shallower areas. And that then discharges those same species out in this new area, right? These are the kind of things, management practices that we've had to make adaptations in order to prevent some of these accidental kind of releases of endangered species. So you'll see educational materials that are geared towards this. It's the same thing with recreational boats and even recreational hiking and that kind of stuff between different areas, even within the United States. So a lot of times when you go from one state to another at the border, they require that you pull over into a boat washing station and actually clean your boat, clean your trailer before you proceed into the state in order to prevent an invasive species from a neighboring state that they weren't able to control from invading areas in the neighboring state, if that makes sense. I don't know if I said that very well, but you get where I'm going. This is a really significant issue. A great example is zebra mussels. So these are from Europe. They like cold water environments, and it was a ballast water thing, right? Partly ballast water. They also attach to hulls, and so there's a couple mechanisms for transport here. But in any event, so they came over, and they made their way in through the region around the Great Lakes, right? So there are some interior ports there. If you've ever been to Montreal, you know the St. Lawrence River. There's ports and industrial facilities all along there, among others. And so they found their way into these colder water areas in the northern United States and Canada. But these organisms are highly adaptable, and in any population, there's a range of uh, genetic characteristics which allows adaptation to occur. And so they very quickly spread in areas that were really initially weren't considered to be part of their region. And so this all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, right? And this happened in a relatively short time frame, in less than a decade. Um, there is quite a bit of information that I have a white box on there, but in any event, there's some information here. You can go and you can copy these links if you want. I'll put them in the notes there. Copy those links, and they're actually animations that show you how the spread of these mussels. And then there's another one for giant sylvania, which is another invasive, and it's a problematic one here in Texas. Zebra mussels, not so much here in Texas yet. I suspect that will be. We are starting to see them, as you can see from this map, spread out into the western United States in areas that are not contiguous with the upper Midwest, the United States, where our first outbreaks occurred. So um, you can see they can make their way around even if there's not a contiguous connection between those waterways. All right, so what are the consequences of this? What actually happens when you have these exotics? Um, introduced into an area that didn't have them before. Um, you know, many invasive species, as I mentioned earlier, really it's hard for them to get established enough to be considered invasive. So you might see them in low levels. Sometimes they'll kind of come and then eventually be pushed back out because they're just not competitive enough. And that really is very situation specific. It has to do with the nature of the environment, the environmental conditions. Sometimes you'll get, for instance, some species don't tolerate freezes very well. So you might have an introduction, they might get a little bit of a foothold, they might actually even persist for some time, and then you get one really good deep freeze and they all die out, right? Or they might not be salt tolerant, and so they might do just fine until you get your first big hurricane that pushes some salt water in and they're done, right? Um, but the ones that are invasive and have these wide ranges of tolerance for conditions can really cause quite a bit of harm. Now, again, um, when we're talking about invasive, it's that they cause change in a community composition or its ecosystem processes. And there are native species that can behave the same way. So most examples are because of introduced species, but not all of them are. There are some that are a result of natives that have found themselves in just the right circumstances where they can really outcompete other things. So, um, the consequences here can be competition where they just out compete and then exclude native species. They can modify the environment in a way that, especially once they have a foothold, they can modify the environment in a way that it kind of precludes other species from re-occupying that area later. So, for instance, Chinese tallow trees, those trees actually produce a toxin in their roots that prevents other plants from encroaching underneath wherever their roots are. Essentially, poisons the environment. They can alter ecosystem processes. That can be hydrology and stuff we'll talk about later. And they can also be very economically expensive. A really good example of this are South American fire ants. These were introduced accidentally. Uh, the, the thinking is that they were introduced via cargo from a cargo ship originated in the United States, at least. That route of entry was through Florida and then found its way. Essentially, now they're all over the Southeast, including here in Texas, and they have huge economic impacts in the agricultural sector, in terms of infrastructure. They can be really problematic, especially in electrical systems. So again, the economic impacts of invasive species are really significant. And I want to clarify something to be sure that we're all on the same page here. This is not a U.S. problem. Okay, this is not something that the rest of the world is doing to us. Um, this is a global issue. Things here become invasives elsewhere. As have become more global as a species ourselves, we have transported a lot of things with us as we've traveled. Oh, this is pretty. I think I'll take it back home and plant it. Oh, I'm going over here. Oh, I didn't see that thing got into my car. Well, okay, come on. So, right, these kind of issues are oftentimes we are the vector, whether purposeful or inadvertent, and it's global. So, let's talk about the first one, competition. So, many of these species simply outcompete and exclude native species. So, one kind of classic example are tea trees in the Everglades in Florida. This was originally an Australian species. It's not the only Australian species. If you're familiar with Phragmites in our area, the Australian cane, also from that part of the world. Um, so it was introduced in Florida in the early 1900s, and it was actually done on purpose because in this instance, it was seen as a lumber source in part. It was seen as an opportunity to help drain swamplands. It's a thirsty plant. It's not the only one that is that way. And in some cases, it was used as a garden plant. Hey, this looks really nice. I think I'd like to put this in my garden, kind of thing. So these are the kind of plants that oftentimes, when we're talking about plants specifically, these are the kind of plants that are brought over in, purposely, so they had some sort of use. And the more different uses they have, the more likely it is that they're going to be brought from wherever they're from to wherever we want them. This is kind of a characteristic of European culture. We were the colonizers. Most of us that have European heritage, it was our forefathers and mothers that wanted to shape wherever they were to be like where they were. So when they left Europe, it's like, okay, let's make this look like Europe. And so that means they brought species with them. Some of our crop species are that way. Some of our pollinators are that way. If you like honeybees, European honeybees. So in any event, the problem here is that once introduced, they can replace natives, especially in stressful intermediate zones between, for this particular tree, between pine trees and bald cypress trees. So if you're familiar with taxodium, which is the only evergreen that drops all of its needles once a year. This plant, it grows, these tea trees grow very quickly, especially following fires. So in areas where you have lightning sparked fire, for instance, these trees rebound very quickly. Now, pine trees, many species of pine trees are keyed to the pine cones opening and the seeds germinating as a result of fire. But this tree responds to it in a much more pronounced way, right? And so fire induces this really massive release of seeds, and in turn, it removes competing species and actually removes that leaf litter as well, which then only helps the seeds that are being dropped by these trees. So the seed density after a fire can reach as much as 250,000 per hectare. So you get these very dense stands then of these trees, which shades everything else out, and boom, you've got a monoculture of these tea trees. So as an example, in the 1990s, the rate of expansion was measured to be as much as 35 acres a day. Okay, think about that. That is just a tremendous number. You know, uh, that's over 100 acres every quarter. So it's just incredible. Anyway, so to manage these, really the only options are chemical application or physical removal. And physical removal is very time consuming, it's very labor intensive, as you might imagine, and very expensive as a result. Chemical applications have secondary impacts on the community. So those can be problematic. There are different methods so sometimes we're talking about aerial sprays, sometimes we're talking about a combination of cutting the trees down and then treating the stump to kill the roots, and then possibly mowing or doing follow-up chemical treatments to control saplings that might emerge over time. Um, in some cases, you can use biologic controls in order to control these. I don't know if your parents ever, as a child, read you the little nursery story about the old lady who lived in the shoe who swallowed a fly. So, so then she swallowed a spider, and then she swallowed something else and something else, right? So you have to be careful when you introduce a species to control another species. There are issues you have to be able to manage. So in 1997, they introduced this weevil. So that can replace utilizing chemicals or physical removal. But you have to be careful when you do this. So we have a similar plant here in Southeast Texas, and I'll talk about in a little while. And there's a biologic control for that, but precautions that we have to introduce. Okay, so like I said, what if the controller gets out of control? An example of this, kind of a famous example, are the mongoose rat scenario. So the mongoose was released in Hawaii to control rats, and they actually did some research. They tried to think this through ahead of time, but they didn't really ask all the right questions. So, for instance, what's the range of the mongoose diet? When are mongoose and rats active? Do they overlap? Are they going to see each other? Right? That mongoose, by the way, looks like me before 10 o'clock in the morning. So, not a morning person. Anyway, um, so that's one example. There are others, where you release fish sometimes to control invasive plants. And the consequence of that is that it turns out the fish eat a wide variety of other things. Okay, that's happened here in Southeast Texas. Um, when you're doing this, you have to have some sort of controls in there. Okay, so actually, I'm going to give you an example of that. I'm going to save it for later, but one example is we have an invasive plant here in Southeast Texas. Um, Now, actually, we have a couple of them that are aquatic. And so this is one here. This is water hyacinth. This is on Armand Bayou, by the way. So this is water hyacinth. But we have another one that's fairly common, especially in freshwater lakes. It is a giant sylvania. And sylvania is often referred to as water lettuce. If you go back and look at the opening slide, my introductory slide, that was water lettuce, giant sylvania, that was on that slide, the background. And it's a lot like water hyacinth in terms of its ability to reproduce, to put on biomass, and can be really problematic in these waterways because it can completely take over the surface of those waterways. When you're treating these kind of things, same thing with water hyacinth, there's limits to what you can do. They reproduce both sexually and asexually. So if you are trying to remove it physically, you break off a part and you don't capture that part before it floats downstream, you might have another colony generate on its own. Sometimes during rainstorms, they just get just parts of a mat will get displaced, and you end up with another raft of these down the way. So the sylvania is one of those issues. Spraying can cause problems for adjacent plants. It can also affect other organisms within those habitats. So Texas Parks and Wildlife has an ongoing program, and you can look this up on your own, where they have introduced another type of weevil, a sylvania weevil, into some of our Texas lakes and rivers, including right here in Southeast Texas. Um, and but they only introduce the males, right? And they're very careful about this. So the idea is you release the males; they can't reproduce once they're out in the waterway, right? You don't want to have you don't want you don't want to release species that is going to make more and then potentially impact other things. So this weevil can feed on other species, but it prefers the sylvania. And if you only release the males, then they're only out there for a limited period of time, and then they die off, right? But in the meantime, they act as a top-down control on on that water lettuce, on that giant sylvania. So, like I said, you have to take some precautions when you're introducing biologic controls. Now, here, if you look at this, one of the things I want to point out to you is when you have one exotic species, that indicates typically again that there's some sort of disturbance, and it is not unusual to find other invasive species. Those might be exotics. Those might be natives that have similar sort of characteristics. And along Armand Bayou, if you ever go spend any time up there, um, they have great kayak tours there, by the way, if you like to kayak. They also have a pontoon boat that sometimes I serve as a guide on the pontoon boat. But in any event, whenever we take pontoon tours up and down there, you'll see numerous exotics and then some native invasive species because there's been so much disturbance in the form of subsidence that's occurred over such a long period of time that it gave a real opportunity for some of these species that so the water hyacinth that you're seeing floating there on the surface of the water was actually brought over purposely as a for water ponds and gardening. Right, it was has a really pretty flower, and so it floats. It's like I said, it's very ornamental. It's been here since the 1880s, originally South American in origin, and it can spread in a remarkable fashion. By the way, this is the flower up here, so you can see why people would be really attracted to this. Um, it has a tremendous growth rate. So, when the conditions are right, you can almost watch this stuff just if you just stand there long enough. It seems like it's growing as you're watching it. Where you have high nutrients, and so this you think about urban environments where there's oftentimes a lot of application of nitrogen, phosphorus-based fertilizers that then well, typically are over applied, then they find their way, in rain runoff and find their way into our local streams, including Armand Bayou. Um, they can really grow rapidly. Now, one thing that really does control them is salinity. They are not salinity tolerant at all. So once these were introduced, so they were brought over on purpose, and because they reproduce both sexually and asexually, they easily find their way into wastewater. So somebody drains their pond, or does some maintenance on it. It's easy for parts of those plants to find their way in that wastewater, and stormwater runoff finds its way right out to the bayous, and boom, you've got an established population. But again, they don't tolerate high salinity. So years where we have very low rainfall, there's not a lot of flow going down our bayous, and so the salinity creeps up. And even in Arm Bayou, we do typically see a couple of years every decade where you're going to have salinities above 16 parts per thousand, which is kind of the break point between where you're going to have salt tolerant organisms or not. And so in those years, they can really have a big impact on those Sylvania, not Sylvania, the hyacinth populations, and kill them back substantially. Um, so when they do overgrow, however, so if you look at this picture here, they can completely cover, if the water's still enough, they can completely cover the top of the water, which prevents oxygen diffusion into the water. So you'll end up displacing, pardon me, or killing fish. They shade the water, so if there were any aquatic species, pardon, any aquatic species that so these would be submerged vegetation. A lot of times that will get shaded out and displaced. So can prevent economic activity like recreational fishing. It's they can be really substantially problematic, and they've gained a foothold in a lot of coastal areas, but particularly here in the southeast, where the conditions are just really favorable for them. They're very similar to where these plants originated at. So, particularly problematic in our area. So, I talked a little bit about biocontrols. I think this one was kind of a funny one. Yes, those are hippopotamus. So, this is a kind of an interesting thing. This picture, now, not all of these are from our area. This picture is actually from Armand Bayou, and you can see this was 2014, and the water hyacinth that actually got pushed downstream this year. That particular year, we happened to have really high rainfall. That dumped a lot of nutrients into the water, so it was nutrient rich. It caused a lot of growth, but it also pushed a lot of these mats in the areas where they got stuck, and then they really boomed, especially once the rainfall started to drop back a little bit. So you can see here maps of this stuff, and in this behind this bridge. But the interesting thing is in other areas, uh, you can see these are these are hippos. So I showed you in the previous slide. Let me go back to that for a second. You can see that there are some populations of hyacinth over here in California. Um, they brought in hippos specifically to feed on that hyacinth, which they do really quite well with. So I just thought that was kind of a funny example. And the hippos are big enough you can monitor those. So and one hippo can eat a lot. So anyway, I thought that was kind of a funny example, but an apt one as well, where you can use a biologic control. Okay, so looking at this book, Wetlands in Danger. What's the hazard that you see in that picture? Well, I know the alligator looks problematic, right? But actually, the bigger hazard here is from the Sylvania, the water lettuce that is surrounding that alligator. This is a particularly, it shares a lot of the same characteristics as the water hyacinth. Okay, so let's shift gears from wetland plants now to terrestrial plants. So I mentioned Chinese tallow earlier, Triatica. And this is an interesting plant because this is another one that was brought over intentionally. In this instance, sometimes it's referred to as the Ben Franklin tree, actually, because Benjamin Franklin, yes, that Benjamin Franklin, the kite loving, electricity capturing founder of our, one of the founding fathers, he brought this tree. He spent some time in Asia and he was very impressed. In Asia, these trees, the tallow oil was utilized for a variety of purposes to make soap, to make candles. They produce prolific seeds. They're really pretty in the fall, as you probably know if you ever drive along any of Texas's back highways and you see in the fall the leaves turning red. Um, 10 to 1, that's going to be a Chinese tallow tree and not something else. We do have some other native trees that will turn color a little bit, but the tallows really turn these beautiful colors of red. And so you're looking at an invasive in those instances. Um, so again, right, these trees were brought over on purpose. He thought there was an opportunity for a cash crop of sorts. Um, they were then later reintroduced, right? So they were kind of intentionally spread by the Department of Agriculture. Um, and there are a lot of reasons for this. In some cases, they do provide some benefits. I'll tell you another way they spread was they're a very quick growing tree. So they're actually really beautiful trees when you look at them. You know, not just in the fall. They grow really quickly. They're rapid growth, like I said. They really pretty shape. The leaves are pretty. They provide a lot of shade. So here in our area along the Gulf Coast, one of the ways that they were spread was actually as housing was built, right? So when you build housing, one of the very first things you do is you go in and you level the land. And that means typically bulldozing if there were any existing trees or any of that sort of stuff. You have to prepare the soil to put in all of the infrastructure that comes with housing. So think electrical lines and piping and roads and all that stuff. The foundations for the houses. So you go in, you level it, and you bulldoze it, get rid of everything that's there. Well, then nobody wants to move into a subdivision that they want to go in and buy a house where there's no trees and it's just this sterile environment. So they the developers oftentimes would plant these tallow trees because they grow very quickly, and so that was very problematic because they spread very quickly as a result, and they're so very disturbed habitat, right? Um, so there's a lot of nutrients available and no competition. There were, once you've leveled and bulldozed an area, you've seen construction sites. There's no competition at all. So when you plant something specifically, it's gonna go like gangbusters. And these plants, because they grow very rapidly and they have a tremendous seed production, and on top of it, that isn't enough the seeds float. So when we have these, what I grew up hearing referred to as toad choker storms, right? And it rains so much even the toads can't breathe. When you get those high runoff events, the seeds will simply float in the runoff water, and then they will germinate in other places. They have long survival time, so the seeds are viable for long periods of time after they drop from the tree. It's just crazy. It's crazy to me how quickly these things spread. They also really like wet soils. Well, guess what? Southeast Texas coast, right? So we have wet, impermeable, clayey soils, and they do really well here. So that means that they can also get a foothold in wetland environments. And when that happens, they can displace freshwater marsh species. And on coastal prairies, they can displace not only emergent wetland species in the potholes, but they can actually displace upland plants as well. Our prairies in southeast Texas and along the coastal plain were significantly modified by the introduction of Chinese tallow, which had a lot of secondary impacts, including to one of our endangered species of grouse, the Atwater prairie chicken. You can read a little bit about that. Yeah, it really significant impacts from this just this one tree. It is listed as a noxious weed. And again, so ornamental planting still continued, again, primarily through expansion of residential housing, especially in the urban areas and suburban areas. And there are still, while you can't go to a nursery and buy a tallow tree, there are people who still will pick up the saplings because they think they're pretty and they'll move them into their yard. So I would say education on this subject isn't as great as it probably should be. So here, if you look at this, so this is a typical prairie environment, right? And so it's got, you see diversity of plants. There's a variety of different, primarily grass species in there, not a lot of woody species. So, a prairie again is going to, in fact, in Texas, along the coastal plain, we have primarily tall grass prairies that extend to clear up into the Midwest, where many of the grasses, think about blue stems, for instance, that are taller than me, brushy blue stem, variety of different species in there. And you can see those represented there. When tallow are able to get a foothold, even in a small disturbed area, and for tallow in particular, and they're not the only plant, but in particular, they don't actually need a whole lot of a disturbance in order to get a foothold in our area. And part of that has to do with the nature of the soils, which are just so favorable for this particular tree. And so once they get a foothold, they grow like crazy. As I mentioned, they actually create some toxicity in the soil around them, which then further displaces and kind of blocks out competition. And then they drop so many seeds that their own trees will grow in the event one of those gets knocked down or broken. I had my late friend Mark Kramer over at the Nature Center. He used to joke that if you cut down a tallow tree, it just ticked it off, and then you have 100 more right in its place. Well, what was happening was you cut down the parent tree, and even if you killed the root system with an herbicide stump treatment, the seedlings that it had dropped over all that time would just all of a sudden they see the light. It's like woo, and then you have 10 times as many in that same spot. It's crazy. So controlling these things once they're established is a real challenge. And there's a lot of methods that have been attempted to try and do so. So Arm and Bayou, for instance, they have treated successfully a lot of their prairie and restored a lot of their prairie habitats, including some of the wetlands in those prairies. And they've done so through a combination of techniques that includes aerial herbicide treatments, cutting the trees, treating the stumps with herbicide, then either mowing. So if you catch the saplings when they're small, the mowing replicates bison that would have come through, 150, 200 years ago, that would come through and graze. Kind of replicates that. So it'll take those saplings down. The mowers will, if it's not too big. And if you do it routinely enough, they never are able to grow tall enough to start displacing other species. And over time, if you keep up with it, so if you're mowing every year, then over time it gives the native grasses an opportunity to finally kind of work their way back in, right? Fire is sometimes used. In fact, I remember you had they had a fire team. I had a couple of students that were on it for a while. They used that. They haven't done that in quite a while in urban environments. Using fire as a suppressant involved a lot of regulatory paperwork and some hazards from you have to be really careful which way the wind's blowing, where's the smoke going, that kind of stuff. So again, this is what we're shooting for when you're looking at when you're looking at a healthy habitat. That's what you want to see, and that is a restored ecosystem. So it can be done, but it is very cost intensive. Okay, so you should be able to answer this just based on what we just said. Reach out to me if you cannot, and we'll talk about it. All right. So, in some instances, some of these non-native species can, in fact, modify the environment in unproductive ways. So, one, and this is actually fairly common on Galveston Island, is tamarisk. Salt cedar is what you know it as, and this was introduced in the U.S. as well. It is very common globally. You'll find species of tamarisk, and it really likes wet areas, and it is a very thirsty tree. There are some areas on the African continent, for instance, where and in the Middle East, where if you have tamarisk, it will actually dry up creeks because it pulls in so much water. So they also have very dense growth. And this combination of reducing surface saturation, lowering water tables, density of their stands can completely alter the natural hydrology of any given area, which then in turn affects everything else around it. So only giving them even more of a foothold. So that's one of the reasons this particular plant tends to increase its populations very rapidly. Okay, so another species you probably would recognize, and it is native actually. So this is an example of a native species that can behave invasively under some conditions. So this is Baccharis hamifolia. Baccharis, again, it's common in Galveston. It's actually common all in the coastal plain. It's sometimes mistaken in coastal environments for Iva frutescens. They're somewhat similar, so when you look at them, the growth forms are somewhat similar. They do occupy similar areas, overlap with each other in some instances. I'm thinking about some preserve properties that I managed in Galveston that had a mix of Iva and Baccharis on it. If you know what you're looking for, they're fairly easy to tell apart. And Baccharis does have these really pretty white flowers when it is in bloom. That really differentiates it at that point. They're really easy to tell apart. But sometimes the leaves are somewhat similar, the growth forms are similar, so they can be mixed up with one another. Again, they're native to upland and prairie habitats across Texas. They are controlled by fires, but fire suppression also equals disturbance. So in some instances, backers can actually utilize fire if it's not completely controlled. So depending on the intensity of the fire, for instance, that can actually create an opportunity for it to outcompete other native species and actually spread. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. Um, uh, when it starts to proliferate and displace the native grasses, this is referred to as woody encroachment. This happens in other areas. Mesquite is another tree that's known for. Tallow trees are another species that are known for woody encroachment, where they slowly take over prairie environments and turn them into forested environments or brushy environments. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the Texas coast has become a lot more brushy over the last 100 years than it was prior to that, even in the last 50 years in many areas. So these species, they alter ecosystem processes like we talked about. That can include changes to trophic relationships. It can include changes to hydrology, to soil and sediment characteristics, like we talked about with tamarisk. So those are potential problems in terms of processes. They can also cause economic problems and aesthetic problems, like I mentioned. So in some instances, things like water hyacinth and sylvania can clog waterways. They can clog intake pipelines. So for things, think about power plants. A lot of times use water from adjacent waterways in order to cool those plants. That can be, and not cool the plants floating in the water, by the way. Power plants, so couldn't resist. So that can be a problem. So this can be for water intakes for other processes as well. They shade out lower plants that are lower in the water column. They lower DO levels, like we talked about, and that can lower funnel densities, which in turn then can have an impact on other. So it can have an impact on the whole community, right? You kind of get this cascading effect where this plant might affect another that affects two or three more, and before long you've got a whole reshaped community that might eventually become a monoculture of whatever your invasive plant is. um, they also present really significant costs in terms of time to manage or eradicate them, and in terms of the cost of doing so. And I use the Iron Body Nature Center a lot because I spend a lot of my recreational time there. So the the amount of time that you have to spend mowing, cutting plants, applying herbicides, the cost of the herbicides, the cost of contractors if you have to use contractors, those things, coupled with the amount of time it takes to control them, because you don't go into these places and just do one treatment and you're done, right? You're going to have to go back and over and over and over and over again. I mentioned my friend Mark Kramer, but another time he mentioned he was probably had inadvertently become the best tallow farmer in the Texas, because every time you cut a tallow, there were so many more that grew, right? And so they had to continue to do treatment, and those costs add up over a period of time. Also, invasives can have really big impacts. I mentioned fire ants earlier as an example, so they can have impacts on other economic activities. We see issues with fisheries where native fish populations get displaced, and that can have an impact on not only the ecology of the environment, but subsequently on economically important species of fish, for instance. Lionfish in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance, in the Florida area, are one of those examples. So how do you eradicate these? Well, I've mentioned a lot of these, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but mowing, fire, herbicides. You can use incentives. So there are incentives for controlling invasives. There's open season on feral hogs, which are a huge problem here in not only in Texas, but across much of the United States. And so they have done things in the past with different types of species where they'll pay you for the hides for some of these species, or they don't restrict hunting and they encourage you to go out and hunt these species. So there are incentives that are put out specifically for these to utilize sportsmen to, sports people to go out and actually help with the problem. Education is another really important tool. A lot of times things are spread just because people don't know. And education is kind of a tricky thing because you need to educate people before it becomes a problem. After it's become a problem, education alone is not enough. So at that point, you've got to start to introduce some of these other measures. But if you can get ahead of something, education a lot of times can go a long way towards controlling those. And there are other methods. And so I want to share with you some resources. You can read on this on your own if you're so inclined. There are some really good free resources that are available online. I've included hot links here. A couple of them that I particularly think are important if you only want to look at two. Oh, pardon me. I'm sorry. I've had a bit of indigestion, but I think I get excited and I breathe too much air. so um, this Texas Prohibited and Controlled Exotic Species is the official list from Texas Parks and Wildlife of prohibited species. If you are going to be in practice in this area, I highly suggest you bookmark this species. There are others here that are really good. I like the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. The A&M Forest Service are good. There's a good citizen science program that's geared towards the layman. So this is a good thing to share with your families, for instance, and actually it's pretty useful for anybody. But one specific to our area that I really like is put together by the Galveston Bay Estuary Program that I've mentioned in previous lectures and the Houston Advanced Research Center, and they put together this invasive species guide. Now, there used to be a paper version of it, and I have some little pocket guides that came out initially, but the list continues to change. So this is very easily accessible as now we're all carrying around our own infinite resources. You can access online anytime you have a signal, and it's really well put together, very user friendly. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. So with that, I'm going to wrap up with this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. And with that, I will see you next time.